Welcome to this episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest for the second time, where we're looking at their take on the game and leadership aspect of the podcast. Who knows what we might find out, because we all look at this differently, and it's always so interesting to see what the guests have in store for me when I turn up, because we never plan this in advance. So I hope you're as excited as me. Let's get into it, and I'll see you on the other side. Welcome to today's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. And I am chuffed to bits to say we've got Dani, the Queen Bee, back with us for her second episode. Welcome back.
I'm back.
I didn't
Here to cause more mischief.
Oh, brilliant. I love a bit of mischief. And definitely didn't scare you off. That's all good. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you, what's your fabulous map behind you indicating?
So, behind me, am I allowed to swear?
Oh,
I'm just going to say a very quick swear. This is my shit weather map. So as we said in the previous episode, you and I met at the beginning, right at the beginning of COVID, right? So just before we went into lockdown, we met at One Manifest. And what happened at the beginning of lockdown is that I realized that there was a real distinct possibility that I was going to sleep my way through however long lockdown was going to be. I think we originally thought it was going to be like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be about 6 weeks. We'll be fine. Couple of weeks and we'll be okay. little did we know. Oh, God. So what I did was every morning, in order to get myself out of bed, I always find that I turn up better for somebody else than I do for myself. You know, I think lots of us are guilty of this, that if it was just me and it was just me that had to get out of bed in the morning, I'd have probably slept in more than I didn't. And I had to keep my kids alive and all that sort of stuff. I had to turn up for my kids, but I'd have probably started to train them to sleep in so that we could all sleep in. And there was a real risk that was there that I wanted to address right at the beginning. So I thought, if this is a risk for me, it's definitely going to be a risk for my community that I was already building. I'd already built a community out on Facebook. So what I decided to do was go live every morning at 8:30 in the morning and get ready for the work day in order to get myself ready, but in order to if somebody was feeling on their own, or if they were locked down and they were feeling lonely, they knew at 8:30 every morning I would be with them, getting ready for the day, geeing them up with some motivation. Oh, wow. And this is what ended up becoming the Show Up, Wise Up, Rise Up show, is that we were going to show up together, we were going to learn together with this time that we had, and we were going to rise up, and that's what we were going to do. Every single morning, then for 2 years, Monday to Friday, I turned up. At the beginning, it was at 8:30, but then as schools opened back up and work happened and what have you, it's now 9:30, 3 days a week, because it was a lot. But it was my fake telly show on Facebook. So what I would do is I would go live in the morning. I'd say, wherever you're watching from, in the UK or abroad, because we've got an international audience, tell me. It's a very British thing to do, isn't it? And I wanted it to feel like breakfast TV, but not frivolous. So I wanted us to be sort of learning about entrepreneurialism. I wanted us to be learning about business, about team, about leadership, about showing up, about spirituality, relationships. Anybody who I could get my hands on to interview, I would interview them. And the very first thing that I would ask them is, what's the weather doing where you are? So I asked them about the shit weather, because we're in the UK, so we're destined to have shit weather. This is my shit weather map. And so there were 3. I've lost a lot of it's now there just for, it's more ornamental than it is anything else. So there was 3 types of weather here in the UK. And at the time, we were very blessed in the UK. The first 10 weeks of lockdown were beautiful. They were scorchio, which is what this bee is all about.
Love
and
him.
Then, for anybody that's listening and not watching, I'm holding up a bee that's in the sunshine. We're pointing to a weather map. And then the other was a rainy bee, which I've lost all of the rainy bees. But the other one is this one, which is it's a bit shit, which is our general response for when most people ask us about the weather. Like, oh, what's the weather like? Oh, it's just a bit shit.
This is resonating with me so much, because you're like, when you get on those meetings, if you can remember back to your corporate days, and it's, oh, how are you? Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
the
all
weather's a
right.
bit shit, isn't it?
So this is the shit weather map
I
where we
love
would
it.
talk about the shit weather.
I'm
And
so glad I asked.
for anybody that can't see, there's a little line. It's actually at where the Watford Gap is, and there's no other like geographical landmarks on there apart from this. Because if anybody wants to know, that anywhere below the Watford Gap is considered down south, and anywhere above the Watford Gap is considered up north. So they're the only two differentiators. For anybody that wants to know, below the Watford Gap is considered down south here in the UK. For anything above the Watford Gap is considered up north, wherever it is that you are, unless you're in Scotland, when the Outer Hebrides are of course up north, but anywhere above the Watford Gap. And that's the only sort of geographical differentiator on the map. Because my husband thought he was being funny.
I love it. I love your husband's humour, and yes, up north and down south,
Right?
of course. Oop north.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Exactly
I'm a pretend northerner, but I'm embracing it fully, because we moved up here just over 7 years ago, and best thing we ever did. And it's not that down south is awful.
Down
It's just
south.
that it was, it's cheaper to live.
Just
And I have
cheaper.
to say,
That's why I'm happy.
people are more friendly up here. I remember my first trip to the supermarket.
Did someone smile at you?
Yeah, and they started talking to me. So it was like this, Dani. It was like this. So it was in Tesco's, my local Tesco's, and this is the lovely lady that was serving us. So she's got this thing. She's like, "Boop. Hello, duck. Who are you then? Oh, this looks nice. I might have to get some of that." And I'm standing there from down south thinking, hurry up! I've got no
Get me
time.
through the flipping checkout. Unless you go to an Aldi or a Lidl's and then they just throw it at you.
Yeah, then they just throw it at you and help throw you out the door with it. Yes.
Exactly.
So, it's been a real change of pace and very, very welcome. I spent 23 years commuting in and out of London for my job and running that rat race. And I do not miss it one night.
It's really interesting because through my corporate years, I used to work 2 days out of London, worked at the Cough, and whereas out of North Acton, and then 3 days between Warrington and Preston. And there's such a stark difference.
Yeah.
And you think that geographically, it's really interesting. I find the UK fascinating, that geographically, we have such cultural differences in between counties, in between accents, and apparently that geographically we have more deviation in dialect than anywhere else in the world. So I live in Preston. I'm 20 minutes away from Blackpool. I'm 20 minutes away from Chorley, but the accent 20 minutes each way is still different. I could tell somebody with a Chorley accent. I could tell somebody with a Blackpool accent. And then, obviously go further afield, 40 minutes the other way, and all of a sudden you in Liverpool, and you've got Scousers that are in Liverpool. You've got in Manchester, the dialect changes again, even in the interim, even in the in-between bits. I find that absolutely fascinating about the UK, that distance does not necessarily denote difference. Whereas when you go somewhere like the US, and you've got to travel miles and miles and miles for days before you even start to see or feel any kind of cultural or dialect differences. I'm so proud to be British. I'm such a lover of being from the UK.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you.
We're a mad bunch.
Very proud to be British. Yes, definitely a mad bunch. And I love that about us. And I love that eclectic mix, if you like, because whilst I was born and bred here, and as were my parents, I've got probably Australian convicts in my background, all sorts of stuff going on. My grandfather's sort of, we're going back great about probably 6 times, I think it is. But anyway, 2 brothers split, the Rutledge brothers. One went to Australia and founded Circular Quay in Sydney, and the other went to the States and was one of the founding members of the US Constitution.
Oh my
So quite
goodness.
famous background.
Paula, no wonder you're in the game of leadership. It's in your blood.
I hadn't thought about it like that, but maybe
I
it
love
is.
that. I have no doubt in my mind. I have no doubt in my mind. That is fascinating. I love that how generate one of the things that I talk about, Paula, is sort of generational patterns. And I was not so lucky that actually generationally things like, addiction, and we'll talk about this in another podcast, but things like addiction and domestic abuse and things like that were the stick that I was handed, and it was up to me to be the change maker within my particular situation. I find it incredible that, you have this, you come from great stock, darling. I love that. Whereas I'm trying to create the stock for the future, like where I am. I'm like stopping in front of the oncoming train of generations of things like abuse and misogyny and stuff like that, to say, no, this stops with me now. We're going to take this bloodline on a little bit of a different journey.
And that makes me go really goosebumpy as you say that, Dani, because I know you are smashing it for your kids. And that is just amazing.
They don't believe that half of the time. They don't realise that.
Of course they don't, but give them a few years and by God, are they going to be, grateful in bucket loads. They will understand, and I'm sure they do. Kids understand much more than we give them credit for sometimes.
Yeah, they do. I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky with my lot. My feral ones, as I refer to them, my feral flowers.
Oh, fabulous. So tell me, this game and leadership combination then, what's it bringing up for you, Dani?
I was really excited when, first of all, when you said this is one of the things that we were going to talk about, it got me scratching my head. I was like, so what have other people said when it's come to this, Paul? Like what like give me some examples. Like I don't know. Actually, I do. I really do know, because game and leadership is something that intrinsically is a huge part of my wider story. And we'll talk about some of those pivotal moments, I know, in another podcast. But for me, playing the long game is really important, because often we find in entrepreneurialism that we want quick wins. We need to feel quick wins in order to keep us in momentum. But sometimes there are bigger things that we want to achieve that are going to take time, they're going to take positioning, and they're going to take some strategic placement. And I think that some of the best leaders think 5 steps ahead of where they are right now instead of just the next step. And a lot of the trap that many entrepreneurs fall into is trying to feed themselves in the moment. Now, I'm not saying that that is a bad thing, because we need to get fed, and if we're not fed in the moment, we won't be fed in 5 steps time. However, if you're not thinking about the moves that you need to make now that are going to pay off in 5 moves time, then actually you're going to come a cropper, because you're going to be in actually the same position that you were in the first instance. You're going to be not as far ahead, because you're not thinking about where everybody else is going to be when time has moved on. And I think that when we talk about game and leadership, I think that for me, it means that what is the change that you want to see in the world, if you can't make that happen overnight, and world change, thought leadership and things like that don't happen overnight, however much we would love them to, we have a very short amount of time in order to make change happen. If we're impatient with that time, it will run away from us. And if we do nothing with that time, it will run away from us. So what we've got to do is we've got to think about, what's the change that we want to see in the world, and what moves do I need to make in what order in order to make that happen. So for me, as you know, I want to help as many people take up space as possible using their superpower hidden in plain sight. Now, I present as a straight white woman, even though I'm a queer white woman, I'm pansexual, but actually I present as, I'm married to a man, and I present as a straight white female. And that means that if I want to work with marginalized communities and offer them up a space that's valuable to them, I've got to share that I am safe. I've got to share that my community is a safe space. In order to make that happen, I've got to not tell people that I'm funny. I've got to make them laugh. I've got to not just say, I'm a safe person. I'm a safe person. You can come and work with me. I've got to show myself as somebody who can provide space to be held. And that's going to take a hot minute from people who are from marginalized communities to see that actually I'm an ally in the field. And instead of telling people that I'm an ally, I have to be an ally.
Yeah.
And what often entrepreneurs do is they tell people that they're good at stuff, or they tell people that they're going to get results. And what they don't do is get the results in order to show what they can do. And there's a degree of, you've got to start before you can really start. But actually, that playing the longer game is essential in forward momentum. That if we go for quick wins all the time, we will only ever get sort of either crickets or an incendiary amount of trajectory, and then it'll fizzle out because there's nowhere for it to go. I've got to be thinking as a leader about 5 years time, 10 years time. Where are conversations going right now, and where will those conversations take us in 5 years time? I've got to look back at the last 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years at social and economic change in order for me to make my considerations about the platforms that I want to create and provide. So the game of leadership is understanding that there's a lot to be done in the moment. Of course there is. We've got mortgages to pay and kids to feed and all of that sort of stuff. But actually, what's the real difference that you want to make in the world? And how do you think not one, not two, but 5 steps ahead? And that's going to mean that you've got to do a lot of educating of yourself. Not relying on people to tell you, because if you're waiting for people to tell you, there's already someone more learned than you out there. You've got to go and get out there with the movers and shakers. You've got to go and get yourself connected, allow yourself to be educated instead of expecting it to come to you. And I think for me, the game of leadership is keeping your finger firmly on the pulse of now, but keeping your finger firmly on the pulse of what seeds are you sowing in a garden that you might not even see.
Yeah.
And are you prepared to sow those seeds? But the great leaders, really great leaders, will allow themselves to sit on the spike and die on the hill to sow those seeds in order for those future generations. And it's so funny, you're talking about the people that have created the US Constitution. They sowed seeds in a garden of flowers that they didn't get to see. And don't get me wrong, it is flawed. And,
Yes,
of course it is. And that's what history does. It is fatally flawed in lots of ways, but actually allows us to build from, and it should be able to build from. So the game of leadership is about self-awareness in the moment and foresight enough to sow the right seeds and trust yourself to sow the right seeds.
Oh, and I'm just going to go boom, drop the mic. Because just when I thought there wasn't another way to look at this, you've come up with another unique way. And as you were talking there, Dani, I mean, fascinatingly insightful stuff, as always. But it just, it was making me think about how I help people see where they want to get to.
Yeah.
So, what is it in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years time that you want to get to? Okay, so let's work backwards and see what do you need to do now, and in all those, I call them ridiculously small steps along the way.
And they feel ridiculously small. They're tiresomely small. They're so frustratingly effing small, but you have to make them.
Exactly. And they're so small that you can't help but achieve them.
Right.
Which means that suddenly this big thing in 5 years' time that feels big and scary and far
like
away,
a mountain, right?
suddenly
it's an elephant.
feels like, well, actually, maybe I can have that if I really want that.
Yeah, it makes me think. I had a really great friend of mine, a guy called Crossley, and one of the things that he said is that you can't skip the steps, and we're very impatient, I think, to skip the steps because we want it all yesterday, and we live in a very now culture. Like we want it now. We've thought of it now. We need to make it, or especially in the way that social media feeds us or keeps us starved. However it is that you look at it, is that all of a sudden somebody woke up one morning and started shitting glitter. That did not happen whatever you see out on social media. Nobody woke up one morning and that's what happened to them. There were so many things, pains, trials, tribulations, learnings that person went through in order to get there. They're showing you the glossy bit on the top. And we spend our lives in comparisonitis, looking out into these,
completely
thinking that, oh, well, if I'm just friends with that person, if I pay this person money, then all of a sudden I can skip the steps. And sometimes you just can't. You can't skip the steps. And also what's really a real revelation, I think, in the last 12 months for me is people overestimate what they can do in 6 months to a year and underestimate what they can do in 5.
Oh gosh, you're so right. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. It really is interesting what we think we can achieve in 6 to 12 months versus what we actually can achieve in 5 years.
Right.
And it is being in it for the long game. You briefly mentioned that in passing, but you're absolutely right. Being in it for that long game, because I remember when I first started, and I'm about to come to the end of my 3rd year, and I'm not there yet by any means, but I've had success and I'm successful along the way.
Yeah.
And all depends on your view of success as well. I choose to see the positive, and in the way that I'm helping people. But you have to embrace the fact that it's going to take you longer than you think. And I remember after about a year and a half, I was like, God, why is this so hard? Why haven't I got that overnight success? And that ugly comparisonitis was rearing its head, which is so unhelpful. And you start talking to people, and actually behind the scenes, you've got probably 4+ years before you start to see results in your business, because it just takes time and consistency and showing up.
And isn't it really not sexy to say that? Your listeners are going, oh God, what do you mean? I've got to be consistent. Right. What do you mean I've got to show up? This is the whole premise of show up, wise up, and rise up, by the way. Like in terms of if I think of gamification, that is something I consistently check in with myself. So I think, right, okay, what does rising up look like for me? What does the next bit look like for me? And there are 2 things that are always missing. So one is that I don't know enough, because if I knew it, I'd be doing it already. Because one of the problems that I don't have is showing up. Like I'm gonna show up for it. Yeah. But for some people, that conversely, they end up being knowledgeable fools. They end up knowing all of the things. They'll do all of the courses and all the programs, have all of the coaches, but they'll not show up. And what the balance is in the game is getting the balance between showing up and rising up, because rising up can only happen off the back of that. It's a mathematical equation. So if you know what you need to know and show up how you need to show up, where you need to show up, when you need to show up, and who you need to show up for, you can only rise up. So if, as your listeners are listening along, if you want kind of the gamification of this, there's your game. That's all you've got to do. It's an equation. How do you play that against yourself every single day? And that's exactly what I do is that, okay, so what's the goal for today? Okay, do I know what I need to know? No? All right, what do I need to learn? Who do I need to learn from? How do I need to learn it? If I know it, okay, where do I need to show up? When? Who? How do I need to look when I get there? What do I need to smell like? How do I need to feel? Like all of this. Turns out today I've turned up like in my prison fatigues.
I love this. You wait till they see episode 30 that I've recorded recently, and I'm in my skivvies. It's all good. We're all human. Today I happen to have been in team meetings and all sorts, so I've got my posh togs on, and
you look beautiful.
I've got my poppy on as well. There we go.
I've got poppy tattoos.
Yeah, you have. They're fabulous. So cool. Look, Dani, goodness me, again, another completely different take on Game of Leadership. And I just love it. It's, God, who knew? I'm so, I'm not beating myself up about this, but there is a part of me that's sad that it took me so long to do this podcast. But I started it when I needed to and when I knew what it needed to be, because now we're doing it. And prior to that, I just didn't know what it was going to be. And it took me about a year and a half to get there. And it came in an instant. It's
Look how
crazy, isn't it?
beautiful you've made it, and all these fabulous listeners that you have now, and how much value that you're getting. And that's, you maybe, again, if we go back to underestimating what you could do in a short amount of time, overestimating, and then underestimating just how much impact you can have when you get there.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your fabulous wisdom with us yet again today.
You're so welcome.
Absolutely fantastic. And super excited because we've got one more episode together.
You're going to have me back?
Oh, if you'll come, when you come
Without
back.
a doubt, try and stop me.
Brilliant. I love it. Thank you so much, Dani. We'll finish off today. And I was going to say, so we've got something to talk about next time. I don't think there's any danger whatsoever of us running out of stuff to talk about.
I got things to say.
Yeah, we've got way too much to say. I love it. But I'll see you next week. Thank you so much, lovely lady. And we will speak next week. Bye for now.
Bye, Paula.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I always think the game episode is one of my favourites because we get a real insight to our guests' take on their ideas of how games and leadership fit together. Every one of them is different, and just when I think there isn't another take that we haven't thought of or covered, one of our guests comes up with something totally different and unique. It's really exciting. Look, now it's your turn. See what you think, see what resonated with you most. And as always, I encourage you to reflect on what you've heard and see what that might mean for your leadership moving forwards. I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox, and this is Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I really look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye for now.